I hope none of you had any trouble accessing to our Zoom meeting for today. This discussion has been created by two important organizations, which they are POHA organization and Padash Youth Support Organization. If you're not familiar with them, I'm gonna give you a brief information about them. POHA organization is a non-profit organization which mainly focus on empowering women, youth, children in Afghanistan. However, Padash Youth Support Organization focus on youth and encourage them to become a successful leader in Afghanistan. So first of all, my name is Maha Zafari and I am a member of POHA organization. And this discussion was created to discuss about the global crisis that is happening right now, which is COVID-19. So in the previous one, we talked about the general impact of COVID-19 in Afghanistan and what are the correct procedures in order to avoid being infected by this virus. So in this one, we wanted to make it more specific. So we chose the economic impact of COVID-19, which can be globally or for our vulnerable country in Afghanistan. So for that, we have an expert speakers all the way from Sweden, and discuss the global impacts of the economic impacts of COVID-19. And so they will talk about the economic impacts in Afghanistan. So first we will have Jonathon Michael, who is associated professor and at the Department of Economic History and Economic History in the Stockholm University. He's very expert in questions related to green jobs, industrial conversion, transmit production, and transmitment. And then we will have Waris Sabah, who is a researcher at the Stockholm University, and he worked with different national and international organizations in Afghanistan. So right now, I would like from Dr. Jonathon to start giving information about the economic global impact of COVID-19 and how countries are handling the situation to make the business and economic productions afloat. You can go ahead, Dr. Jonathon.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. I hope can everybody hear me properly?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. Okay, so the basic idea is that this crisis is a crisis on the demand side and the supply side. So we'll just deal with the basics. On the supply side, what's happening is it's very obvious. It's very hard for certain people to get to work because there's lockdowns or there's disruptions of meetings of certain sizes. Excuse me. And so that makes it very difficult, and people don't want to get the disease or they become sick. And so that is the problem on the supply side. And even if workers in a factory like in Sweden might be relatively healthy, if they don't get key components from a factory, let's say in China, then they have to close down because they don't have the parts to do their job. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side, what's happening is that as workers are laid off, and there's millions of workers, for example, in the US that have been laid off, millions and millions, there's less demand for certain products and services. Now, some people are relatively unaffected, except for having to do work at home, but not everybody can work at home. So one of the key issues about this in terms of the effects is where you are in the division of labor. If you're a university professor type like me or associate professor, you can do your classes online and the students are online and you have meetings online. So for us, it's relatively secure in that sense, on an economic sense. But if you have to work in the food service provision, the only way to deliver the food is, sometimes food, of course, is now delivered on motorbikes and vans are delivering food, but like in the supermarket, you have to interact with the customer. And so that's one issue. As a result of these disruptions, it is also having secondary effects, like in the stock market, where you can, if you've invested for your pension, and not everybody can do that, of course, or make other investments, these have been disrupted. So there's those effects. Some of the effects are potentially mitigated or corrected with investments that are made by governments, like bailout packages. Swedish government has done this, US government, British government, and so they provide an artificial stimulus. But, and then some people who want to have more ambitious proposals argue that this is a precedent, or it's an example of what could be done in the future. You know, government could spend money to do useful things, but there's a difference between governments investing in, let's say, mass transit on alternative energy systems, and people in governments investing, let's say, just in giving people wages. I mean, I'm not saying I'm against giving people wages, because people have to eat and have to pay for their housing, but I am saying that if you had people working and then you invested in the tools and the services and the infrastructure that would enhance their work, that would have been better. But I mean, we have a crisis which we can't erase. So these are some of the most basic things going on in the economy. And the question, of course, is some countries are trading off security and economic growth. And there's several considerations. I mean, on the one hand, planners are making economic decisions. What do we do to get the economy going? On the other hand, they're making health decisions. If we start certain things too soon, we risk a primary or a secondary wave of the virus. And then the other consideration is actually political, because in certain areas like the US, where I'm from originally, there is an exotic political culture where people will take guns and demand things be open. And even if these people are irrational, the president over there is encouraging them. So you have the political, the health, and the economic. And so these planners are weighing all three. I mean, on the one hand, if you have a lot of people die, that could be bad for the politics. On the other hand, if you want a lot of people opening things, or they can't get to their jobs, that also affects the politics. So these are the three calculations that will decide things. And some of the decisions are made without knowing the full outcomes, or we call ramifications. What is really going to be the outcome of this? So this is sort of the big picture. And governments have to struggle. Some governments, like Sweden, have saved a lot of money, so it's easier for them to spend the money. Others have a habit of printing the money because they're the world currency reserve, like US, and so ultimately they can do that. There is a tension in the US between whether the money would go for the workers or the companies. Ultimately, you have to support the workers because people have to eat and they have to take care of their housing. In some areas like New York City, one of the economic impacts is that they have passed a rule where you can't throw people out of their housing. So that's actually, I mean, many economists may not think about it, but that's a basic economic fact. So you have that also as part of the considerations. But the problem is, what happens in a society where they don't have a lot of savings, they can't print the money. I mean, what are they supposed to do? So this is a problem. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is the first kind of way to think about some of the solutions to these very, very basic problems. So what this crisis has done is exposed 5 key contradictions, which I would like to talk about. The first one is the one economic aspect of this crisis is the use of land and deforestation. And what has happened is a lot of these wild animals like bats and things like that are becoming into closer and closer contact with human beings because of the way in which the land is organized and used. And so there have been what we call in some countries land grabs or land seizures, or farmers taking over forests and things like this, like in the Amazon and elsewhere. So there's been massive deforestation. And as you break down the barriers or the boundaries between animals and human beings, you're more likely to get this kind of a crisis. And what this indicates is that one has to have some kind of plan for these rural areas and farmers and people like that who do this in part to get a livelihood. So it's partially it's a problem of development, where you deforest to make, support agribusinesses and big global transnational companies, and partially it's a problem of underdevelopment for the poorer people who feel that they must participate in this, or those who are greedy. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that we have a lot of assets and a lot of money being spent on things that is not terribly useful, or ultimately not useful. So while everybody has legitimate security needs, we have countries like the United States, and this is also part of the economic situation, which has spent trillions of dollars on military spending and things like that. And they could be spending it on human needs. So that's the issue. And we also have to think about reutilizing. So in some countries like Israel and elsewhere, Britain, either defense or aerospace capacities have been used to make the needed health equipment. So it's part of a solution. And have written about this, and I can send you the links in the chat, or somehow you can get them later, 2 articles related to these conversion processes. In Sweden, a lot of the workers in the airline industry have converted into things like health workers, in the hospitals. Then the next thing is, there is a lot of money being spent by governments, but where is it channeled? It would be better if it were channeled into institutions that people could directly control, like cooperatives and cooperative banks and special institutions that are controlled by the people, rather than elite groups, which have sometimes misused the money or not directly transferred the money to the people. So we have to think about building up alternative institutions. And one of the things that's necessary is to create greater rights and empowerment for workers. So in Britain, the United States, and Sweden, people who are immigrants or African American or Afro-Caribbean in the British context, and even Asians in Britain, they have been suffering much greater from this crisis because of the way they have less resources in the home and people are crowded into housing, or because they are in these frontline jobs that are lower in the economic ladder. They're not in the professional managerial class. The last thing that I think has to be, well, 2 of the last things I'd like to talk about is the issue of how we get the information. So in many areas in the US, Nigeria, elsewhere, people have engaged in false news or less accurate information, whether it comes from governments or others. And some places did not get the full information they could have had early enough about masks, the threat of the danger, the threat to the economy, and all the rest of it. And so one key institutional challenge is to link in platforms like this, citizens and people to informational resources. We have to take experts and the citizens and local groups and link them. And there are models for this. I can send you the links about this. And citizens have to be more involved in planning. They can't wait around for the government to give them false information or late information. And then the last thing is, I think we need to have some kind of permanent mobilization of citizens and activists in order to address the economic, political, and media aspects of this crisis. So now I'm involved in a project with about 19 countries and over 25 locations that's designed to precisely do this, mobilize people on a basis where they can begin to promote these alternatives, whether it's cooperatives, conversions, investing in things that make societies more resilient and more democratic and more equitable. So I think that's all I should say, because I may have talked too long.
No, thank you so much for your significant information about COVID-19. I think there is no country can rise up without having a good economic productions. and COVID-19 is starting to make it really hard for even rich countries. And I guess like rich countries will struggle with it, and poor countries will get poorer. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it's the time for Waris Sabah to share information about the economic impact of COVID-19 in Afghanistan. Waris Sabah, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's really hard to follow Jonathon because he covers the whole picture. So I will try to not repeat what he already discussed, and I will focus more on the economic impact of this global health crisis on Afghanistan specifically. I was told by Mustafa to prepare slides, PowerPoint slides. So I prepared, I must admit, I don't really like slides, but I prepared slides. So I will just share the screen so that you all can see it. Yeah. So share screen. What's disabled participants? Oh, it's disabled. Host has disabled participants screen sharing. Could you check that? It's written that the host has disabled participants screen sharing. I think it's with the administrator, probably the access.
Mustafa, can you please check that?
Otherwise, I can just start without.
Just give me minutes.
Yeah.
Mustafa Jan, I would highly appreciate if you.
Now we can share. Yeah.
Now I can share it. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Great.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. F5, come on. Okay. So as I said, I will briefly go through the economic impact of the COVID-19 in Afghanistan, and these are some of the topics that I will discuss in this presentation. And before focusing specifically on the current economic impact of the COVID-19, it's important to understand the brief history of Afghanistan's economy. So Afghanistan's economy has often been in the history associated with its political history, and it's a landlocked country and is situated at the crossroads of Asia. So it has a lot of potential for major supply of natural resources, but it hasn't been living to its full potential because of the political tensions, obviously. And in this presentation, I will begin with the examination of the early Cold War, before the Cold War era, and then I will focus on the Soviet period, and then move to the civil crisis in the 1990s, and then conclude with the current state of the Afghanistan economy. So the economy of the pre-Soviet Afghanistan. So we all know that the British invaded Afghanistan in 1838, which also marked the first of the three Anglo-Afghan wars that framed Afghanistan's role as the buffer state in the 19th century. And when Afghanistan achieved its independence in the 1990 after the World War I, the leader at the time, King Amanullah Khan, he tried to modernize the Afghans' economy and centralize the economy. And this effort actually continued even after he was deposed in the 1929 by his successor, King Zahir Shah. And this continued all the way to the 1950s. And Afghanistan's economy from 1950 onwards became intertwined and entangled in the Cold War, because there was a Cold War between the US and Russia. And the king who the successor of King Zahir Shah, King Daud Khan, which was his cousin also. He actually received aid both from the USSR and also from the United States. So it's also often referred to as the economic Korea. Why? Because 50% of the aid he was receiving from the USSR and 30% from the United States between the era 1950 to 1970. So in the 1960s, actually, Soviet invested a lot in the infrastructure in Afghanistan, and they built also the tunnel, the historic tunnel, the Salang Tunnel, which we all know about, which Afghanistan has immensely benefited from throughout these years. So in the 1970s, however, the economic situation declined in Afghanistan, and this was mainly due to the criticism from the socialists, the Maoists, and also the liberal factions against the government financial policy at the time. And of course, because of this criticism and from that faction of the society, the currency declined, and then there was a famine and poverty throughout the country. And yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so in order to promote the industrial development in Afghanistan, banks were nationalized, and the government gained control of the most of the private sectors. But what happened then is that in the 1979, the Soviet entered Afghanistan officially, and this caused, of course, distress in the West, and the financial aid and the assistance that Afghanistan was receiving from the West declined, obviously, and Afghanistan was dependent more on the financial aid and assistance from the USSR. And yeah, and there were, of course, such some improvements, but not fully, because the educated and the liberal part of the society, people, they fled, they became either refugees in the neighboring countries or in the Western countries. So they actually drained this term, which is used, the society at the time. And after the Soviet invasion, of course, the flights also were canceled. Certain flights to Afghanistan were canceled because of the restrictions and sanctions on the Soviet Union at the time. So because of the cancellation of these flights, the export were affected, and Afghanistan became more an import oriented economy than it was an export oriented. Yeah. And there was a massive focus on the spending spending on the military sector, and this was of course funded by the USSR, and yeah, and almost 50%. There was decline almost 50% in the GDP from the time from the early King Amanullah Khan's time to when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And what happened after from the 1989 to 2001? So the Soviet, of course, they were defeated and they withdrew, and then Afghanistan was engulfed by civil war. And we all know about the 7 to 8 groups, Mujahideen groups, with their leaders, which were based in Pakistan, operating from Pakistan. And once the Soviet left, they came into Afghanistan. All of them, there was a struggle for power, and this they all announced their own government, and of course they issued and printed their own currency. And what happened, that the real Afghan currency was totally depreciated, so it lost its value. And most parts of the country, for example, in Kandahar, they announced the leaders, the landlord, the warlords, they announced their own rule, and in Mazar-e-Sharif they announced their own, and in Nangarhar the rivals announced their own government. So this affected, of course, the economy, and then it paved the way for for the Taliban to enter. And we all know that in 1996, Taliban entered Afghanistan, and they took control of almost all of the Afghanistan except for the certain parts in the north of Afghanistan. And there were no ties, political ties, economic ties during the Taliban regime, except for 3 countries. We had like, we were recognized by 3 countries at the time: Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the economy was mostly it was from the income was from the opium. It became highly opium export country at the time, and we still suffer because of that. And this continued until 2001, when the international community kind of liberated Afghanistan from the extremists and Taliban, and then there was a conference in Bonn, and a new government with the leadership of Hamid Karzai was installed in Afghanistan, and of course money was poured in, and Afghanistan since then has been highly dependent, till now actually 90% of the economy is dependent on the foreign assistance and financial aid. So since 2001, the defeat and the fall of the Taliban and the and assistance from the international community, things haven't changed so much. The economy is still dependent on foreign assistance, but in 2016, the conference in Brussels, actually, the international community actually gathered and tried to find a durable and sustainable solution on how to make Afghanistan, the economies, sustainable and independent. So and the Brussels conference actually resulted in this 4 years framework for Afghanistan on how to make it self-reliant. And the follow-up conference was in Geneva, which I participated in, and then there will be the 2020 conference in Brussels. And the reports will be shared by the current government on whether, to what extent have they become self-reliant. Yeah. And now coming to what the COVID-19 outbreak means for Afghanistan's economy. Well, even before the pandemic, the World Bank actually in their report shared that due to the ongoing Chinese and US trade wars, and also the Brexit, the economies of conflict-affected economies, which Afghanistan is one of the conflict-affected country, will be affected because of the trade war and the Brexit. So obviously, when the pandemic came, it will worsen the situation, and how it worsens, we can even discuss this further in the question and answer session, but it will worsen situation because it's, as I said, it's highly foreign aid and foreign assistance dependent economy. For example, the foreign assistance from Sweden, I could give you just example of Sweden because I'm here. Afghanistan is the largest aid recipient country when it comes to Swedish foreign aid. And how it works with aid is that every country, they have one, in Sweden, there's 1% of their GDP, which is every year in their budget, which is allocated to foreign assistance. And they help like different countries in Africa and Asia, these poor countries, and Afghanistan is on the top of the Swedish foreign assistance. So during this pandemic, the GDP of Sweden affected negatively is it decreased, and when it decreases, the GDP decreases, that means that the foreign assistance will decrease, and the foreign assistance to Afghanistan will, since it's dependent on foreign assistance, it will affect the economy of in a very worse way. So yeah, so this, so what I see out of this pandemic is 3 scenarios, and this scenario number 1 could be actually a fast and V-shaped recovery, which is more an optimistic view. If China and East Asian countries, include also USA and Europe, they fully control the outbreak and they come up with a vaccine within this year, and then of course the borders open, this could lead to a fast recovery, and it won't affect us so badly. But the second scenario which I see is the protracted recovery with permanent scars. So let's say the vaccine doesn't come up this year and comes up somewhere in next year, in the middle of next year, which experts often say that maybe we don't come up with a vaccine even until the beginning of 2021. So if we don't come up with the vaccine, and in China, United States, Europe, and East Asian countries, they don't contain the pandemic so well, let's say until August, and the borders remain closed, of course, this will have also a very severe effect on the economy, or global economy, including the economy of Afghanistan. But there is still hope if the vaccine comes up sometime next year. But the third scenario could be a global meltdown with fragmentation and deglobalization and a large output losses, and that's a case where we don't come up with a vaccine even next year. So the borders will stay closed the whole year for the rest of the year in 2020, and then of course when the borders are closed, this affects the movements of people, goods, and products, which affects countries' exports and imports, and this could also somehow contribute to the political tension that's going on between some of the global powers like the United States, China, Russia, and then this will affect all of us, which I hope we don't see the situation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Waris Sabah. And Afghanistan is already encountered with many difficulties, and COVID-19 is another burden on the poor Afghan citizens. So I think you mentioned really great information about the impacts of COVID-19 in Afghanistan. Thank you both, Waris Sabah and Dr. Jonathon, for attending our meeting today and spend your time just talk and share your information with us.
Sure, pleasure.
I think the most important part of the meeting is done, and now it's the turn for the participants to share their information or to talk, or if they have any question, just ask. So if anyone has any question, please raise your hand and relate it to either Dr. Jonathon or to Waris Sabah.